1700s, at the University of Oxford, a lawyer named Henry Birkhead had an idea. He thought to himself, if you go to Oxford, you sit with a professor and you write and do research and get feedback from them, and most of the instruction at Oxford is done one-on-one. It's good. It trains the future leaders of Britain, future lords, future lawyers, future theologians. But what about poetry? How are students learning poetry? Learning about how to speak about literature in a way that makes them as excellent in their thoughts on that great and ancient art as they are in their thoughts on law, theology, and other things. So what Birkhead did is he gave an endowment, basically means a lot of money, so that Oxford University could create what's called the Chair of Poetry. Since 1708 to the present day, there has always been an Oxford Professor of Poetry. Let's talk a little bit about what the Professor of Poetry does. Now, if you or I were to be asked to be a Professor of Poetry, I think we would think, well, I'll teach poetry classes. But that's not what the Oxford Professor of Poetry does. The Oxford Professor of Poetry has actually very few responsibilities. Their main responsibility is to give one lecture per semester at Oxford to, well, not just Oxford students, anyone who wants to come hear it. Of course, Oxford students want to come hear it, especially if they're studying in the humanities. But the Oxford Professor of Poetry lectures become these events that Oxford hosts that kind of projects poetry and poetic literacy, and even more generally, an awareness and an appreciation of literature to the whole world. Now, if you look at the list of Oxford Professor of Poetry chair holders, many of the names you won't recognize. For instance, Joseph Trapp was the first professor of poetry. He started in 1708 and he lasted until 1718. After him was Thomas Warton the Elder. After him was Joseph Spence and John Whitfield, William Hawkins and Thomas Warton the Younger, Benjamin Wheeler, Joseph Randolph, Robert Holmes, James Hurtis. These are people who, in their time, most of this is the early to late 1700s, in their time would have been respected writers and thinkers when it comes to literature. But these aren't the great poets of their ages. Now, I think one of the things that is tricky about poetry is that poetry is not something that if you're good at writing it, you're necessarily good at eloquently speaking about it, especially in a learned way. And so often Oxford professors of poetry have not been primarily poets themselves. They've been men of letters, men who study literature, men who want to promote literature and investigate and analyze poetry, but have not been themselves great poets. This begins to kind of change in the 1800s. A couple things happen. So from 1708 onwards until around the mid-1800s, the Oxford Professor of Poetry always delivered their lecture in Latin. If you're a literary and a literarily inclined gentleman of the 1700s or 1800s, maybe Latin won't really be difficult for you to understand. But around the mid-1800s, this is sort of the mid-Victorian era, we end up getting professors of poetry start giving their lectures in English. And kind of the most important early English lecturer who was the professor of poetry is a man named Matthew Arnold. Now, Matthew Arnold, his lectures kind of became kind of the first modern Oxford professor of poetry lectures that are still studied and debated and talked about within poetry circles. When I was in graduate school, Matthew Arnold's professor of poetry lectures were lectures that people read and talked about and argued about. Matthew Arnold was also himself an accomplished poet, one who has become canonical with a couple of his poems, especially the poem Dover Beach. Matthew Arnold kind of created this image of the English-speaking, poetry-practicing professor of poetry, and this continued on into the 20th century. Probably the most famous of the 20th century professors of poetry in the early part of the century was W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden was born and raised in England, educated in England, but ended up coming over to America during World War II. and kind of had this Anglo-American voice where he could kind of speak both from the English perspective and also the more modern 20th century American perspective. And his poetry kind of bridged this gap of Anglophone literature, talking about the plight of English speakers and the degradation of society, but also calling us to higher ideals. One of the things that is interesting about the professor of poetry in the 20th century is also this kind of movement away from just only having Brits. Before the 20th century, most everyone was an Englishman, both English and a man. In the 20th century, we start getting not necessarily Americans, though I think Auden got his American citizenship, but he was still, born an Englishman. But you start having Scottish and even Irish professors of poetry. Probably the most important professor of poetry in the late 20th century is Seamus Heaney, who is an Irish poet. He may have been the first Irish poet to hold the position. Seamus Heaney was also not just a poet, but also a translator. His translation of Beowulf became a very standard text in both American and British schools. So we start getting kind of an opening out to the different British Commonwealths. We don't just have English voices. We have Irish voices. We have Anglo-American voices. We have Scottish voices. And then in the early 20th century or 21st century, we have 3 women elected to the position, not in a row, but within the course of about 15 years. The first woman who was elected to the position was Ruth Paddle. The problem was there was some controversy, not necessarily over Ruth being appointed, but the election had gone in the favor of Derek Walcott, who is a Caribbean poet. But there were some questions about how upstanding a person he was. There was some things in his background and biography that Oxford was uncomfortable with. And Paddle was kind of appointed as a replacement for him. She didn't like the circumstances in which she was elected. There was a lot of he said, she said. Paddle graciously said, I'm going to step down. This isn't good for the position. And Geoffrey Hill, who turned out to be, I think, the greatest of the 21st century Oxford professors of poetry, was appointed. And Hill himself didn't really like the situation, but he ended up serving as Oxford professor of poetry. One thing that Hill did that is interesting is Oxford will arrange for the professor of poetry to give poetry readings at Oxford. Often these are great poets, Seamus Heaney, W.H. Auden, some of the greatest poets of the 20th century. Geoffrey Hill himself is one of the greatest poets of the late 20th into the 21st century. Geoffrey Hill said, "I will not read any of my poems ever on campus." He said it would be an affront to the office. He just wanted to talk about poetry. He didn't want to peddle his own wares, he said. So different professors of poetry have very different attitudes. Geoffrey Hill, very, very academic, very dry, even very antagonistic in his views about modern poetry. There are things in Hill's lectures that sound as if he doesn't really like modern poetry at all, which I think he would say he doesn't really. Then there was Simon Armitage, who came after Geoffrey Hill. This is in the mid-20 teens. Simon Armitage is a much more generous, open figure. Also a translator, like Seamus Heaney. Simon Armitage translates a lot of medieval and early Renaissance poetry. He had much more of an expansive view. He wasn't as sort of limited and precise in his view. Alice Oswald came after Simon Armitage. Alice Oswald is a poet who is kind of similar to Armitage, is very open and excited about contemporary poetry. And yet, like Armitage, she also goes to the poets of the past. Her final lecture, called Counterblast, a Manifesto, which was presented in 2023, it talked a lot about Homer and Homeric structures in the metaphors that she say become sort of the main poetic structure of Homer. So the last few professors of poetry have been very open in their vision of poetry, tried to be very inclusive, but also remind us of the medieval and ancient traditions. Now, in 2023, there was a new election for the professor of poetry, and A.E. Stallings, Alicia Stallings, was elected. Now, this is important for a couple reasons. First, she's only the second woman who has actually served in the post. Remember, Ruth Paddle had been elected back in the early aughts, but ended up not giving any lectures because she didn't like the kind of controversy within which she was elected professor of poetry. A.E. Stallings is American. She's the first American to ever be elected to the position. And she's a really interesting voice in that she's born and raised in America, but she currently lives and has lived for almost the last 2 decades or more in Greece. I want to talk more about A.E. Stallings and her vision of poetry and her approach to poetry in subsequent videos. Hopefully this has given you a picture of the Oxford Professor of Poetry. I focused on and gave you details from the more recent professors of poetry. One of the reasons I did that was because I want you to go on Oxford's website. I'll put a link down below in the description of the video. I want you to go on Oxford's website and check out some of these Professor of Poetry lectures. We have everything from Geoffrey Hill, who served in the early 20-teens, all the way up through some of A.E. Stallings' most recent lectures. And I want you to listen to them if you're interested and kind of get a sense for what is the Oxford Chair of Poetry talking about? What do they care about? What are they trying to educate the world about? Thanks for hanging out with us and thinking about the history of the Oxford Professor of Poetry. We're going to dive into A.E. Stallings' both poetry and some of her big ideas about poetry in some subsequent videos.